Now I have the privilege of introducing our guest teacher, Mark Charles. Mark Charles is a speaker, writer, and consultant. He is the son of an American woman of Dutch heritage and a Navajo man. He teaches with insight into the complexities of American history regarding race, culture, and faith in order to help forge a path of healing and conciliation for the nation. He is one of the leading authorities on the 15th century's doctrine of discovery and its influence on American history and its intersection with modern day society. Mark has also co authored a book entitled Unsettling Truths: The Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. And he shared this morning before the gathering that if you order his book from his website, wirelesshogan.com, you will get an autographed copy of the book. Mark Charles was also an independent candidate for the US presidency in the most recent 2020 election. Friends, remember, if you have questions for Mark, drop them in the comments on Facebook or in the chat on Zoom throughout the gathering, and we'll do our best to sort through those after his presentation. Mark, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. It's great to be with you, and I'm honored to be able to be a part of your service today. So thank you for the invitation. Before I begin, let me introduce myself. So Yate, Mark Charles Yinishya, Sin Bakadina and Nishle, Dr. Higlini Bashichin, Sin Bakadina Dashache, Dr. Chitni Dashanella. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our four clans. We're matrilineal as a people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and so I say Tsinbake Dene. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tor Higlini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsinbake Dene. And then my fourth clan, my father's father, is Toruchini, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Piscataway. I moved from the Navajo Nation to what is now known as Washington, D.C. about 5.5 years ago. And these are the lands indigenous to the Piscataway. They are the people indigenous to these lands, and they are still here. They were here long before Columbus got lost at sea, and they are still here. I've had the opportunity to meet some of the Piscataway. I've been welcomed to these lands by the Piscataway. I am humbled to be living on Piscataway lands, and I want to honor them and thank them for their stewardship of these lands. The church where you are at, or you would normally attend, is in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And Grand Rapids, Michigan is the lands, traditionally of the Peoria, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. And I have had the chance, I actually travel to Grand Rapids several times a year. I do a lot of work with Calvin Seminary and the Institute of Christian Worship, and I've spoken and taught all throughout Grand Rapids, and I am humbled every time I go there by the stewardship of the Peoria, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, and I want to thank them and publicly honor them for their stewardship of those lands. For the next 40 to 45 minutes, I want to talk to you about the doctrine of discovery. Many of you may have heard me speak before. Because I go to Grand Rapids so frequently, you probably have heard me lecture on the doctrine of discovery. Maybe you have even read my book, Unsettling Truths: The Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. Myself and my co-author, Seung-Chan Rah, had that book published about a year ago. It came out in November of 2019. And we've been using it as a resource to teach this history. And the first 4 chapters of the book are really, they're not even chapters we intended to initially focus on in the book. But as we did the research and as we wrote our manuscript, we realized that we really had to focus and lay the groundwork of how the church got from the teachings of Jesus, who said things like to pray for your enemies and to love your enemies, and to pray for those who persecute you, how we got from those teachings to a doctrine that literally said to kill people who do not look, speak, worship, or act like you. And understanding how we got from point A to point B, actually helps us understand why this doctrine has been such a devastating part of both Western European history, US history, and why it's still so devastating today, even in the year 2020 here in the United States of America. And so I want to take some time to go through that. I'm going to share my screen here, and we'll go through. We're treating this kind of like a lecture, but we're also going to be hitting on some very key biblical themes. And so we'll be referencing a lot of passages in Scripture, especially in the New Testament, as we talk about Jesus and his teachings and how the church began to twist those teachings. So let me go ahead and just share my screen here, and then we will get this going. Just give me just a second here. Okay, so here we go. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I am not the only person teaching on the doctrine of discovery. There are some tremendous scholars and authors, especially from the Native American community, who have done a lot of work to bring the narrative and the issue of the doctrine of discovery to the forefront. I had the chance, I've had the honor of meeting several of these people, many of these people. One is this elder from South Dakota, and I met her during the campaign over the past year, and 99-year-old woman who, Marcella LeBeau is her name, and she was actually at the Frank Lemire Native American Presidential Forum asking candidates about Native history and about the doctrine of discovery. She's a World War II veteran. She served as a nurse, and I was so honored to meet her and to see her tenacity in bringing these issues of our nation's history and the doctrine of discovery to the forefront, including questioning personally presidential candidates, myself, and other candidates who were at the Franklin Lemire Forum in Iowa. Another author who's done a tremendous amount of work is Stephen Newcomb. And his book, Pagans in the Promised Land, is one of the books I recommend most frequently for people to read. Steve and I don't agree on everything, but he has a very sharp and a very good critique and analysis of the doctrine of discovery and how it came out of the church and what it's done to our nation. And I highly recommend this book for people who want to read it. To understand the impact of the doctrine of discovery and what it's done, we really have to go back into the history of not only our nation, but the history of our church. And we need to go all the way back into the Old Testament. I tell people all the time that you cannot understand US history without first understanding the history of the church. We say we have a separation of church and state here, but that's really not true. The two are so intertwined and have been intertwined for so many hundreds, even thousands of years, that if you do not understand the history of the church, you will never fully understand the history of our nation. So I want to go all the way back to the Old Testament, where we have an understanding of land covenant. The God of Abraham makes a land covenant with the people of Israel. First, he makes it with Abraham. Later, he extends it to his sons and to his family, and then he includes all the people of Israel in this land covenant. And the land covenant, basically, what it says is it says that if you obey God's commands, he will bless you, and if you disobey his commands, he will exile you from the lands. And so this land covenant became sort of a barometer for the people of Israel. And they could tell, they could have a gauge of how they were doing in their relationship with God based on their land covenant and the prosperity that it either promised or challenged. So if their families were healthy, if their borders were strong, if they were on their land and their crops were growing, the people of Israel could rest assured that they were doing well in their relationship with God. If they were exiled from their lands, if they were removed from them, if they were not didn't have strong borders, if their families were not healthy, they could get a clue that there was something awry, something amiss in their relationship with God, and begin to look for how they needed to repent. So throughout all the Old Testament, their prosperity, the prosperity of Israel, was not the only barometer, but one of the barometers that they had for their relationship with God. So this is why the kingdom of David and the king and the reign of Solomon was so rooted in their history of prosperity, because right, King David secured their borders and expanded the kingdom, and he was a man after God's own heart, and he really built up the kingdom of Israel. And then Solomon was one of the wealthiest and one of the wisest kings in all of their history. And they saw that prosperity, and those were kind of the golden age of the kingdom of Israel. And it was based on their land covenant and the prosperity that came from these two kings who were so close to God's heart. So when Jesus came into this world, in the point where he did, the people of Israel were not necessarily prospering, right? They were under the oppression of the Roman Empire. They were not able to worship freely. They were being taxed. They were having censuses taken. They could not worship open and freely. They were not completely removed from their lands, but nor were they enjoying the freedom of their own sovereignty and their own nation. And they were very much under the oppression of the people of Israel. And so the people of Israel were looking for God to send a Messiah. They were looking for this Messiah to come in a political and an imperial way and to throw off the oppression of the Roman Empire and to restore them back to some of the greatness that they remembered of the kingdom of David. This is what they were looking for. And Jesus, when he came into this world, he came as the Messiah, but he was trying to change their expectations and trying to get them to have a different take on this role of the Messiah. So yes, he was the Messiah, but he was born in a barn, right? And raised as a refugee in Egypt. Yes, he was the Son of God, but he was raised in the backwater town of Nazareth. Yes, angels announced his coming and his birth, but they were singing to a group of shepherds. Right? So he was coming and trying to change expectations. And early in his ministry, we see in Matthew chapter 4, Satan takes Jesus to a high place and he shows them all the kingdoms of the world. And he says to Jesus that if you bow down to me, I will give you these kingdoms, which is what he assumed was the goal of what Jesus had come to do. Jesus resisted that temptation, rebuked Satan, and walked away. In Luke, we see that John was the one who was kind of announcing Jesus' coming. He was the one out in the desert, the voice crying out in the wilderness, who was announcing the coming of Jesus. And in Luke 7, he's in prison. And while in prison, he hears stories that Jesus is healing the children of widows and healing the servants of centurions. Now, this made no sense to John, someone who was expecting a political and imperial Messiah, right? Widows had very little value in the community, and the Roman centurion, that was the enemy. And John was so bewildered by what Jesus was doing that he sent his disciples to ask Jesus, hey, are you the one we're looking for, or are we waiting for somebody else? I love Jesus' response, right? He turns around. He heals more sick. He casts out more demons, gives sight to more of the blind, hearing to more of the deaf. He helps more of the impoverished and the marginalized. And then he says to John's disciples, go back and tell your master what you've seen. And blessed is the man who does not fall away on account of me. Right? Jesus is rebuking John here. He's saying, this is who I am. This is what I'm doing. Either get on board or get out of the way. In John 6, Jesus feeds 5,000 men, probably 10 to 15,000 men, women, and children, which is the lunch of a small child. And the people are so amazed by this that they come and they want to make him king by force. Again, Jesus has other plans. And so he walks away. He does not allow them to establish him as their earthly king. In Luke chapter 9, Jesus goes into a Samaritan village. And the Samaritans, who were part Jews, but they also had intermarried with Gentiles, and they were now really hated by the Jewish people. They were actually seen as some of the reason why they were not prospering, and because they had broke covenant with the God of Abraham and they had married outside the Jewish line. And the Jews really did not like the Samaritans. And so Jesus goes with his disciples into Samaria, and the Samaritans reject him. And as they're walking out, James and John say to Jesus, would you like us? Can we be the ones to call down fire from heaven and destroy them, right? This is what they assumed the goal was. This is how they've seen it in the past, right? When God sends you a prophet, if you repent, yes, he has mercy. But if you reject the prophet, it's fire and brimstone, right? We saw that in Sodom and Gomorrah. We saw that with Elijah. So the disciples just assumed these Samaritans, who they were very, very benevolent in going to them in the first place, now that they rejected Jesus, now it was time to call down fire and destroy them. And James and John were excited about being the ones who could maybe possibly do that. And Jesus rebukes them. No, this is not what we're doing. Then he sends them on to another Samaritan village. In Mark 8, the middle of the Gospel of Mark, Jesus has been showing his disciples for several chapters, 6 or 7 chapters, who he is and what his role is, trying to change their expectations of the Messiah, the Son of Man. And in Mark 8, he asks his disciples, who do the people think I am? They say, well, some think you're Elijah. Others think you're John the Baptist, who's been killed. Others think that you are one of the Old Testament prophets. Jesus said, well, who do you think I am? Looking right at the disciples. Peter, who's always quick to answer, raises his hand and says, you're the Messiah. Now, Jesus doesn't congratulate him. He doesn't say, this is great. I'm glad you got it. This was the whole goal. Now let's go on. Or even say, my job here is done. But he actually tells Peter not to say anything, to be quiet. And then he begins to teach them what the role of the Messiah actually is. That the Messiah, the Son of Man, was actually coming to be persecuted and even crucified. This was so contrary to what the disciples expected, that Peter took his own teacher aside and began to rebuke him. When Jesus saw the other disciples watching the spectacle, he turned to Peter and said, get behind me, Satan. You're not on the side of God, but of men. In Luke 21, Jesus expands this teaching. And he says that not only will he be persecuted, but his disciples and his followers will be persecuted. He said they will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison. You will be brought before kings and governors, all on account of my name. You will be betrayed by even parents, brothers, sisters, relatives, and friends. They will put some of you to death. Everyone, he promised his disciples, will hate you because of me. He's changing their expectations. In Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus addresses their understanding, their barometer of prosperity. They believed that they would be blessed if they obeyed God's command and they would prosper in their lands. And Jesus says, blessed are you, not when you prosper, but when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. He said, in those days, rejoice and be glad, because great will be your reward in heaven. In the same way, they persecuted the prophets who were before you. See, Jesus is trying to change the barometer that the disciples had. They would know they were doing well in their discipleship, not when they prospered, but when they were persecuted. The disciples did not like that barometer. They didn't like it at all. In Mark 9, there's a very interesting passage where Jesus' disciples are out and they find somebody who is casting out demons and healing the sick in the name of Jesus, but he wasn't one of them. He wasn't one of the apostles. He wasn't with their group. And they told him to stop. And they were so proud of what they did, they came to Jesus kind of bragging about what they had done. And Jesus, don't stop them. He says, anyone who gives you a cup of water in my name will certainly not lose their reward. But then he goes on And he says, if you cause one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better if you tied a millstone around your neck and threw yourself into the ocean. He says, if your hand causes you to think you're better than someone else, cut it off. It's better to enter life maimed than with two hands to be thrown into hell. He says, if your eye causes you to believe you're better than someone else, gouge it out. It's better to go into life blind than with two eyes to be thrown into hell. It's interesting. Jesus saves his most sharpest rebukes, his most clear threats, not to tax collectors and sinners, not to Samaritans, not to their Roman oppressors. Jesus saves his sharpest rebukes, his most clear threats of hell for his disciples when they begin thinking that because they're with Jesus, they're somehow better than other people. Jesus goes on and he's trying to convince them, and he's being adamant here that his kingdom is not of this earth. He's trying to show them when he walks away from Satan, when he walks away from the people in John who came to make him king, he's trying to convince them that his kingdom is somewhere else. When he gets captured and he's put before Pilate, and Pilate, right, doesn't want to crucify him. He's trying to find a reason to let him go. And he's asking Jesus questions, and Jesus isn't answering. And Pilate's getting a little perturbed by this. And he says, don't you know that I have the power to set you free, to kill you? And Jesus says, you have no authority over me. The only authority you have is what my Father in heaven gave you. My kingdom is not of this earth, he said. If it were, my servants, the angels, would come and set me free. He said, no, my kingdom is from somewhere else. So not only was Jesus changing the barometer of what it meant to be with God, but he was adamant that his kingdom was not an earthly kingdom, and it was somewhere else, and it would not be established here on earth. His kingdom, he said in John 18, verse 36, was from another place. It took, literally from that passage in chapter 8 of Mark, it took until Pentecost for the disciples to finally get on board with Jesus' vision, right? They were fighting it the entire way. They did not want to believe that their Messiah was intended to be not only persecuted, but crucified. And they definitely did not like the idea that they were going to be persecuted and crucified along with him. In fact, when the people came to arrest Jesus, Peter pulls out his sword and starts slicing off ears. Then when Jesus rebukes him and puts the ear back on, the disciples flee and run away. They don't want any part of this. It's not until Pentecost that the disciples finally realize, after Jesus has risen from the dead, after they've seen him, after they've been reinstated by him, and after he's ascended into heaven and the Holy Spirit has come upon them, is the first time they finally get clued into the fact that, yes, this new barometer is what was intended, and they begin to embrace it. And throughout the rest of the scriptures, you see almost all of the disciples, and we know this through history too, that most of the disciples go on not only to be persecuted, but most of them, beginning with Stephen, even die a martyr's death. They finally embrace this new barometer that Jesus has set up. And so when we look at the history of the church, the first through the third century, we have this church, this small church that's being persecuted by the empire and by the religious establishment. You join this church through your baptism, your confessions, your discipleship, and through your community. And when you join this church, you know that there is a very good chance you will be persecuted and maybe even killed, martyred, because of your membership in this church. Now, in the 4th century, we have what would be called the rise of Christendom, the creation of Christian empire. Now, if you're like me, I've blamed the heresy of Christendom all of my life on Constantine, right? He's the one who converted. He said he saw this vision at Milvian Bridge. He said that he was meant to conquer under this cross. He converts to Christianity. He Christianizes Rome. And all my life, I've blamed this heresy of Christendom on Constantine. But as we were writing our book, and we actually wanted to include the story of the vision that he saw in this book, and so we began researching how he converted and what led to his conversion. And what we were struck by, what I was most struck by, was how it wasn't Constantine who came up with this heresy of Christian empire. It was actually his mentor, Eusebius. Eusebius was the bishop of Caesarea, and he was writing a book around the turn of the 4th century called Ecclesiastical History, the history of the church, right? It's a volume actually of 11 books. The first few books establish the divinity of Christ, starting with the persecution of the babies who were killed when Jesus was born, and picking up with Stephen. It goes through the history of the first 3.5 centuries of the church, highlighting the piety of the martyrs and these people who were sacrificing their lives, who were embracing the teachings of Jesus so thoroughly that they were being killed for their faith and for their beliefs. And he holds these men and women up as heroes, as pious examples of the faith. In book 8, that begins to change. And in book 8, he introduces Constantinius, who he calls the kindest and mildest of emperors. And then he introduces Constantine, Constantinius' son, and says he was proclaimed by the supreme emperor and Augustus by the universal sovereign God. He's propping up Constantine as a God-ordained emperor of Rome. He compares this battle at Milvian Bridge to Moses defeating Pharaoh at the Red Sea, one of the greatest military victories in all of Israel's history. What he's beginning to do, he's beginning to change the narrative. And now, instead of focusing on the martyrs and the piety and their faith and their sacrifice, now he's focusing more on the emperors. And in between books 8 and 9, he inserts a book. It's called the Book of the Martyrs. This book is about what's known as the Great Persecution. It took place in 303 AD. One of the bloodiest, if not the bloodiest persecution in all of church history. And in this book, he acknowledges that he knew many of the martyrs personally. He saw several of their deaths himself. So the persecution touches him. And now his narrative begins to change. And instead of focusing on the faith and the sacrifice of the martyrs, now he begins focusing on the emperors, seeming to look for a way to end this persecution. Now that it's touched him and he's decided, I don't like this, he wants to find a way to end the persecution. And so he props up Constantine as a God-ordained emperor. And he compares his victory at Milvian Bridge as comparable to Moses defeating Pharaoh at the Red Sea. Now, if you're writing a book called Ecclesiastical History, right? The history of the church, we know that Christ is the bridegroom of the church. And this history will not conclude until the bridegroom returns. So if you're writing a book called Ecclesiastical History, the very fact that you're writing the book demonstrates this history hasn't concluded. And so your book is merely a preface, a chapter in this long saga of the story of the church waiting for the return of its bridegroom. However, if you read Ecclesiastical History, all 11 volumes, all 11 books, and you get to the final chapter of the final book, you will find that Eusebius's understanding of ecclesiastical history actually does have a conclusion. He writes in this chapter that's titled The Victory of Constantine and the Blessings of Him Accrued to the Whole Roman World. He says, they celebrated splendid and festive days with joys and hilarity. All things were filled with light, and all who were stuck in sorrow, beheld each other with smiling and cheerful faces. At the same time, they celebrated and extolled, first of all, God, the universal King, because thus they were taught. Then they also celebrated the praises of the pious emperor, and with him all his divinely favored children. There was perfect oblivion of past evils, and past wickedness was buried in forgetfulness. There was nothing but enjoyment of the present blessings and expectations of those yet to come. The supreme God granted from heaven above the fruits of his piety, the trophies of victory over the wicked and that nefarious tyrant with all his counselors and adherents. He cast prostrate, not at the feet of Christ, but of Constantine. See, his book absolutely has a conclusion, and the conclusion has almost nothing to do with Christ. According to Eusebius, ecclesiastical history concludes by the salvation that comes to Rome, not through Christ, but through Constantine. See, if you want to change the barometer from suffering back to prosperity, if you want to establish a Christian empire here on earth, your biggest obstacle is going to be Christ. So if you want to create a heresy known as Christian empire, you literally have to write Christ out of ecclesiastical history, which is exactly what Eusebius does. He writes Christ out of ecclesiastical history and concludes this book where salvation comes to Rome not through Christ, but through Constantine. His next book, The Life of the Blessed Emperor Constantine, is just flat out heresy. Right? Chapter 4 is titled How God Honored Constantine. Chapter 6 is titled He Was the Servant of God and the Conqueror of Nations. Chapter 8 was titled He Conquered the Whole World. What did Satan promise to Jesus if he would bow down to him? The entire world. It says he received the submission of all rulers, governors, and satraps and barbarous nations who cheerfully welcomed and saluted him. Constantine alone of all emperors was acknowledged and celebrated by all. Chapters 28, he records that while Constantine was praying, God sent him a vision of a cross of light in the heavens at midday with an inscription admonishing him to conquer by that. Now, there's another church father who saw a vision of Christ after he ascended into heaven, and that was Peter, right? Our Paul, right? He was traveling to Damascus to persecute the church. And on his way, he was confronted, met by Jesus in a vision. And it was so crazy, it blinded him. And Christ sent him stumbling into Damascus. And he sat there for 3 days. And then the Spirit sent Ananias to Jesus, or to Paul. And what did he tell him? He said, go and tell him how much he must suffer on account of my name. Why? Was God punishing him? No, he was calling Paul to be an apostle to the Gentiles. And when you follow Jesus, how do you know you're doing well in your discipleship? Not when you prosper, but when you suffer. He was saying in this vision and through this teachings to Saul that you are going to be an apostle to the Gentiles and you are going to not prosper, but suffer greatly on account of my name. So it makes absolutely no sense that Christ would appear to the most mighty emperor in the most mighty empire in the world and tell him that he must now conquer under the symbol of a cross. Constantine may have seen a vision. I promise you, it was not of Christ. He did not see a vision of Christ. Christ would not tell this emperor to conquer under the symbol of a cross. But that's what Constantine claimed. And that's what Eusebius recorded. This, of course, is now a heresy that fundamentally changes what it means to be the church. Now, instead of joining the church through your baptism, your confession, your discipleship, and your community, now you become a member of the church based on your citizenship in this worldly empire. So the question is, what will the theologians, the church, do about this heresy? Will they be complicit with it? Or will they prophesy to it? Will they conclude with it? Will they collude with it? Or will they oppose it? Well, in the 5th century, we have Augustine, one of the major theologians of the day. And he develops what's known as a just war theory. Now, the just war theory exists primarily for two purposes. It exists to exhort Christian nations to enact war more justly. And it also exists to justify how Christian citizens of these Christian nations can go off and kill in the name of God and country. I would say the fact that Augustine created a just war theory, developed it, is proof that he was working to collude with this heresy rather than to prophesy to it. But I wanted to see where he crossed the line. Where did he go over the edge? Because when you go over the edge with Christ, right, he tends to rebuke you. He doesn't reject you, but he rebukes you. And so I was looking for where he crossed the line. I looked through his writings on just war. I couldn't find it. I looked for his writings on the two kingdoms. I couldn't find it. I was looking through his writings on heretics, and I looked at one of his books on the correction of the Donatists, and I came across this quote. So in these books, the Donatists are a heretical group. They're leading the church astray. They've been kind of a thorn in Augustine's side his entire ministry, and he is pondering in this book, what is the role of a Christian king in a Christian empire, right? Throughout their entire history, they've never had a ruler in the empire from their faith. They were always persecuted by the empire. Now that the empire is Christian and the rulers are Christian, he's pondering theologically, what is the role of a Christian king in a Christian empire? It's not a horrible question. It has a horrible premise, because you see, he accepts the notion that there's such a thing theologically as Christian empire, which isn't true. Again, Jesus was adamant. His kingdom was not here of this earth. He was not a political imperial Messiah. But this is what Augustine's pondering. And he writes that the role of this king is to prevent and chastise with religious severity all those acts which are done in opposition to the commands of the Lord. He says he serves the Lord by enforcing with suitable rigor such laws as ordain what is righteous and punishes what is the reverse. He says it's better indeed in chapter 6 that men should be led to worship of God by teaching than they should be driven to it by fear of punishment or pain. But we found advantage in first being compelled by fear and pain so that afterwards they might be influenced by teaching. This is where Augustine crosses the line, right? Jesus never said anything like this. Augustine is writing that the role of a Christian king in a Christian empire is to compel people through fear, punishment, and pain to obey the teachings of the church. This is completely contrary to what Jesus taught and what he modeled in his ministry and in his life. This, of course, lays the foundations for what are known as the Crusades, which is about expanding Christian empire and protecting Jerusalem. As we go into the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas, another major theologian, he's also questioning what to do with heretics. And he says that what's the role of the heretics? Or what's the church to do about heretics? He said, for it's a much graver matter to corrupt the faith which quickens the soul than to forge money which supports temporal life. Wherefore, if forgers of money and other evildoers are forthwith condemned to death by the secular authority, how much more reason is there for heretics, as soon as they are convicted of heresy, to not only be excommunicated, but even put to death? So Thomas Aquinas is arguing that the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is now to kill people who disobey the teachings of the church. This is completely contrary to what Jesus ever even imagined teaching. Also in the 13th century, the church defines a new category of others called the infidels, applied to those who worship other gods, primarily indigenous peoples and the Moors or the Muslims. Now that we have this category of other defined theologically, now we don't even need a just war theory to base our wars on. Now they're based on theological grounds. We're fighting the other. We're fighting the enemies of Christ. And so out of this, in 1452, Pope Nicholas V writes out these words: to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, to convert them to his and to their use and profit. This was a papal bull written in 1452. This papal bull, along with others written between 1452 and 1493, are collectively known as what we call the doctrine of discovery. It's essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, Whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours to take. This is literally the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people because they did not believe them to be human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in this new world already inhabited by millions and claim to have discovered it. Right? If you think about it, you cannot discover lands already inhabited. You can steal those lands. You can conquer those lands. You can even colonize those lands. You cannot discover them unless your theology teaches you that the people who are there are not fully human. Now, initially, the Protestant church pushed back against this doctrine. They didn't fully buy into it. This was a Catholic doctrine. In 1630, John Winthrop was on board a ship, and now they were harbored in what's now called the Boston Harbor. They were actually here to plant a colony, the Boston Colony. And on board this ship, John Winthrop preached a sermon titled A Model of Christian Charity. In this sermon, he referred to the people he was with as a city upon a hill. Now, this is language he borrowed from the Sermon on the Mount, the teachings of Jesus, where he told the disciples to be a lamp on a stand, a city on a hill, shining their good deeds into this dark world. He goes on to exhort them, John Winthrop does, and says, in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality, we should rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. We should keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. These are just your basic Protestant church-going exhortations, right? We hear these things all the time. At the end of his sermon, he's trying to convince his congregants to keep his exhortations. And he quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 30. Now, Deuteronomy 30 is the passage in the Old Testament where the people of Israel are standing at the banks of the Jordan River, ready to cross over and take possession of their promised lands. And Joshua, God is exhorting them, teaching them what they're to do with the Canaanites who are living in their promised lands. And what they should do, he's actually reiterating the threats and promises of the land covenant is what he's doing. And he says, but if our hearts shall turn away so that we will not obey and we worship other gods, we will surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it. He's saying if we obey God, we'll be blessed in these lands. If we disobey God, we will be exiled from these lands. If our hearts will turn away and we do not obey and we worship other gods, we will surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it. These are the threats and promises of the land covenant. Now, John Winthrop, in quoting this passage, the passage says river. But in his sermon, John Winthrop changes that word to vast sea. Why does he do that? Well, because they didn't cross an ocean. Or they didn't cross the river, right? They crossed an ocean. So what's he saying? Based on the teachings of Jesus to be a city on a hill, based on all of Old Testament Israel, they are standing on the banks of their promised lands, ready to go and take possession of them. Now, if you read the books of Deuteronomy and Joshua, God is very clear about what you're supposed to do to the Canaanites, the pagans who live in your promised lands. In Deuteronomy 30 or 20, it says, however, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. See, according to promised land theology, promised lands for one people is literally God-ordained genocide for another. Now, you're thinking, Mr. Charles, that's a bit of a stretch. We don't think that way, especially not today. I want you to think back a few years ago, 2015, during the Obama administration. The Obama administration was negotiating a nuclear deal, this treaty with Iran. And Prime Minister Netanyahu and most of the Republicans were opposed to this deal. And so they invited, the Republican leadership invited Netanyahu to give a speech to a joint session of Congress. That Congress, like today's Congress, was incredibly divided, deeply, deeply partisan. Weren't even talking to each other. And Prime Minister Netanyahu had to get everyone on the same page behind him as he was lobbying against this nuclear deal. And so he hit on one of the most unifying themes in all of American politics, which is the theme of American exceptionalism. And early in his speech, he said to our Congress, because America and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands. See, there is a very dysfunctional, codependent relationship that exists between the United States of America and the modern nation state of Israel. Our relationship actually has very little to do with freedom and justice and equality. Our dysfunctional, codependent relationship is wrapped up in this misappropriation of the theology of promised lands. The United States of America needs Israel's Old Testament legacy of promised lands to justify what we've done to African Americans and Native Americans. And the modern nation state of Israel needs our flourishing as a nation with a manifest destiny to justify what they're doing to Bedouins and Palestinians. We have a very dysfunctional, codependent relationship with the modern nation state of Israel. It has nothing to do with freedom, justice, and equality. It's all about justifying oppression, and in our case, even genocide. We go on, this was the 1630s. I actually call that sermon by John Winthrop, The Birth of American Exceptionalism. In 1776, we signed a Declaration of Independence, which says we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. It sounds very promising. However, 30 lines later, this very same document refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. In 1787, we write a constitution, also begins very inclusive, we the people of the United States. However, Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women, specifically excludes natives, counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who's left? White landowning men. That's who could vote. We wrote a constitution specifically to protect the interests, not of all the people, but of white landowning men. About the same time, we begin expanding westward. We're going past the Mississippi River, past the Appalachian Mountains. End of the 1700s, we have the Second Great Awakening. There's this growth in churches. There's a renewal of denominations. There's this religious fervor as we're moving further and further west. Early 1800s, we declare a manifest destiny that this nation of white Europeans is God's chosen people, and they have the right to rule these lands from sea to shining sea. So now that we have this dehumanizing doctrine of discovery, this white supremacist Declaration of Independence, this white supremacist constitution, racist and sexist as well, and God's permission to complete manifest destiny, which gives you the justification for genocide. Now we have some really unjust history. If you look at our history, look at 1775 to 2016, you'll see this is our nation's history. I looked at every year that our nation was fighting against another nation or entity. I put that in blue. I then put every year our nation was fighting its native nations in red. You'll see that for the first 2/3 of our history, we were almost at constant state of war against native peoples. And from 1811 to 1886, we had almost 75 straight years of warfare against native peoples. These are some of the wars we fought during the 18th century. The 18th century is the century we refer to as our century of expansion. We add 30 new states to the Union during this century. Clearly, this is not expansion, right? This is ethnic cleansing and genocide. It's in this period we have the Indian Removal Act, which is what justifies, allows the government to move native nations like the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw during the why can't I think of the word? Not the Long Walk, but during the Trail of Tears. We have 1862, the largest mass execution in the history of our nation with the hanging of the Dakota 38. We have the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado. We have Indian boarding schools being started. The goal is to kill the Indian to save the man. We have the massacre at Wounded Knee, one of the most horrific massacres in our nation's history. 300 to 350 Dakota men, women, and children slaughtered in a single day by the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army awards 20 Congressional Medals of Honor to the U.S. soldiers who participate in those massacres. 3 of them, specifically, there was a ravine at Wounded Knee where the Dakota ran into once the fighting started. 3 of the Medals of Honor are Congress awarded. The one to William Austin, John Gresham, and Albert McMillan were given specifically for their going into that ravine and flushing the Dakota people out of there so they could be mowed down by the guns. In 1840, this is what our nation looked like. We have about to the Mississippi River. These are our established states and territories. Beyond that is more uncharted lands. If you look up Medals of Honor by city, by war and by conflict, you will find that between 1839 and 1898, the U.S. Army awards, or U.S. Congress awards 425 Medals of Honor to U.S. soldiers who participated in the Indian War campaigns. And at the end of that century, this is what our nation looked like. We've now completed our manifest destiny. During this century, the majority population ballooned from 5.3 million to 76.2 million. The native population collapses from 600,000 to 237,000. If you're doing the math, that's a 61.47% rate of genocide. If you're comparing your math, that's almost twice the rate of Nazi Germany's Holocaust of the Jews in World War II. One of our greatest presidents, Abraham Lincoln, is also one of the most white supremacist and ethnic cleansing presidents of our entire history. In our book, we have 2 chapters devoted to the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. He was a blatant white supremacist who said during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, "I have no intention of making voters or jurors of Negroes or allowing them to hold office or to intermarry. There's a physical difference between the white and black races, which will forever forbid the 2 from living in terms of social and political equality," wrote Abraham Lincoln. "But as long as they have to remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, believe that the superior position belongs to the white race." He was a blatant white supremacist. At his memorial, the basement of the base of the memorial, there's a museum, has writings of different parts of Abraham Lincoln's legacy. One wall has plaques, marble plaques, 3-4 feet tall, 2.5 feet wide, with different quotes and sayings of him about his thoughts on the Union. Middle of that wall is this plaque that says, "My paramount object," wrote Abraham Lincoln, "is not to save the Union. It is to save the Union. It's not to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." There's a quote, a plaque hanging at the Lincoln Memorial that literally says, according to Abraham Lincoln, black lives don't matter. In 1862, he signed the Pacific Railway Act. And in this act, it allotted lands to complete Manifest Destiny, to complete the Transcontinental Railway. Within 2.5 years of signing that act, after the Dakota War of 1862 and the hanging of the Dakota 38, after the long walk of the Navajo and Mescalero Apache in the territory of New Mexico in 1863, and after the Sand Creek Massacre of the Cheyenne and Arapaho in 1864, Abraham Lincoln has literally ethnically cleansed all of the native peoples from the states of Minnesota, the states of Colorado, and the territory of New Mexico, 3 of the primary routes of the Transcontinental Railway, making him one of the most genocidal presidents in our history. I can only imagine how many lives were saved because he was assassinated, native lives, because he was assassinated in 1865. And his final legacy, right, the 13th Amendment, which most people think abolishes slavery. It doesn't actually abolish slavery. What it says is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party has been duly convicted, shall exist. 13th Amendment doesn't abolish slavery, it redefines and codifies it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. the same justice system that is literally lynching, shooting, and murdering people of color today. Mass incarceration. This is where Abraham Lincoln constitutionally protected the institution of slavery and the lie of white supremacy. And we're seeing its fruits in society today. In the 1500s, the world population was 480 million. In 1900, it was 1.6 billion. In Europe, the population in those 400 years grew from 82 million to 300 million for a 3.65% rate of growth. Africa went from 63 million to 123 million. Even with the horrors of the slave trade, they grew at a rate of 1.782. The US went from 0 European people to 76 million. The native population, this is a conservative estimate of continental United States, 6 million in 1500s. The low was 237,000 in 1870. That's a growth rate of 0.395, which is actually a rate of death. There's a genocide rate of 96.05% from 1500 to 1900 here in North America. That's greater than the genocide rate of the genocide in Rwanda. That's greater than the genocide rate of Nazi Germany over the Jews. One of the most effective genocides in the history of the world took place here on Turtle Island. It was so bad that in 1851, Peter Burnett, the first governor of California, in his State of the State address, this is what he said: that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or the wisdom of man to avert. He's not saying famine has struck and we can't feed these people, so they're dying. And he's not saying that disease has broken out and we can't stop it spread, so they're dying. He's literally saying we cannot stop killing these people until they're exterminated and we complete our manifest destiny. Right? Because this is what you're supposed to do when you have promised lands. This is what you're supposed to do when you're God's chosen people. This is what you're supposed to do to the pagans who live in your promised land, right? This is what Joshua did. So Joshua subdued the whole region, including the hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, and the mountain slopes together with all their kings. He left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Why do you think Jesus was so adamant with his disciples when they thought they were better than someone else because they were with Jesus? Why was he so adamant that his kingdom was not of this earth? Why was he so adamant that his barometer was one of suffering, not one of prosperity? Why did he literally threaten his disciples with hell had they gone on believing that they were better than other people because they were with Jesus? Because he knew what they would do. He knew what they would do. The heresy of Christian empire. The prostitution of the church. To empire. The doctrine of discovery is a white, male, Christian supremacist doctrine. It has had devastating effects on global history. And it's the fruit of a church that has literally prostituted itself out to the empire. And we're still living with that fruit today. We've never addressed it. We've never dealt with it. one of the concluding themes in our book on Selling Truth, which is the book started out actually, Sing Chanran, I started out as a call to lament. And as we wrote the history, and as we saw more and more what the church was doing even today in the United States, we realized this isn't just a call to lament, this is a flat out rebuke. We shifted our book in the middle of it and said, we have to just flat out rebuke the church for what we're doing, what we are complicit in, what we've done throughout our history. And so that's what we wrote, and that's what we're calling the church to. There's a great quote by a Dene elder. He's from the Dene people up in Canada, when he was writing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission up there. He said, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where communities to be formed, he wrote, common memory must be created. I truly believe even before the church can lament, even before the church can repent, even before the church can turn from its wicked ways, it has to understand what it's done. We have to create this common memory. We have to understand what it is that we're standing on and how horrible that history is. If we're ever going to have any hope of taking the intentional steps that are needed to fix it, we have to be able to deal with it, which means we have to know what it was. One of the things I've been advocating for the past 5 or 6 years is that the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation I would put on par with the Truth and the Reconciliation Commissions that took place in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. I wouldn't call ours Truth and Reconciliation because reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony, which clearly is not accurate. I would call ours Truth and Conciliation, and I've been doing everything I can to try and make this happen sooner rather than later. The church has a role to play in this. Absolutely has a role. The church has blood on its hands and is absolutely complicit. And I'm not just talking about white evangelicals and the conservative church here in America. I'm talking about the church that at some level throughout all of Western Christianity has embraced this heresy of Christian empire. Right? We even see it in how we even see it in how we approach lament. The passage, I don't think I have it on my screen here, but one of the passages I like to point out to people is this passage in the Old Testament where it says, if my people, because if I call the church of Christ to lament, right? If I'm going to call the church to lament and truly ask the church to wrestle with its history and what it's been complicit in, someone somewhere very quickly is going to pull out this passage that says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways, right? We all know this verse. We've all heard it before. And if I call the church to lament its history, the church will turn to that verse and will say, yes, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways, I will hear their prayer. I will forgive their sins. And what? I will heal their land. See, the problem is the church is so deeply embedded with this heresy, we can't ever escape it, even if we try. There is such a belief. That passage was not written to the American church. That was a passage for Old Testament Israel, reaffirming the land covenant they have with the God of Abraham. White European Christians, Western Christianity, guess what? You are not God's chosen people. Turtle Island is not your promised land. There is nothing in the scriptures that say, if you turn from your wicked ways, God will heal the land that you stole. That's not the covenant. This is why both the left and the right, the conservative and the liberal, the progressive and the conservative church needs to wrestle with this. This is a bipartisan value. This is what our faith, our history, our nation is rooted in. This heresy. And the way we're going to get through it is to lament, to sit in the brokenness. When the people of God lament, he always, always, always shows up. He doesn't come quickly, but he shows up. My co-author, Seung-Chan Rah, wrote a book called Prophetic Lament. I love the book. It's one of the reasons we connected on this project to write the book we wrote on Settling Truth. He points out that the purpose of lament, the discipline of lament, is like going to a funeral dirge where you have a dead body in the casket. You don't go there to raise the body. You go there to weep. You go there to mourn. You go there to say goodbye. He points out how anemic Western Christianity is at the process of lament. I observe that it's difficult to lament when you believe in your own exceptionalism. When the people of God lament, God shows up. Because Western Christianity does not lament, and even if it does, it's for a few seconds, not for very long at all. There's this whole side of God we've never interacted with. We've never interacted as a church, the Western church, with a God who meets you in lament. This is why I'm not calling the church to a season of lament. I'm not calling the church to a period of lament or a service of lament. I'm calling the church to a season of lament. Because who changes the seasons? Creator. I could go on about these things for hours, but I wanted just to help you understand how horrific, how terrible the history of the church has been. How it has been used to justify unthinkable actions, dehumanizing practices, horrible laws and policies that are literally being played out in front of our eyes today. The doctrine of discovery was referenced by the United States Supreme Court as the legal precedent for land titles as recently as 2005 in an opinion written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The church clings to this narrative of promised land theology and the heresy of Christian empire because we don't know what to do if we're actually accountable for actions that we've taken. So we need to lament. I want to thank you for inviting me into your space this Sunday. I know this was a bit of a harder message, but I'm really grateful that you're wrestling with some of these issues. I want to encourage you to continue to look at the scriptures. I invite you to look at the book that we've written. It goes in depth into all the stuff I've talked about. I invite you to search the scriptures and to begin to decolonize your faith, to root out the heresy of Christian empire, to restore your relationship with the God of creation, and to learn how to think about ourselves, not in imperial terms, but in terms of relationship with Creator and with the creation that we have been placed in. I can't have my relatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. My impulse is to want to sit with all of this. But if you're willing, I would like to offer the community a chance to ask you a few questions if you have a little bit more time to stay with us.
I'm very open to doing that, yeah.
Okay. Um, the first one that came through on Facebook from our friend Janet. Early on in your presentation, you talked about sort of the barometer for a relationship with God, or in our community, we might talk about that in sort of like healthy spirituality. Um, After hearing all this and making sense of our lives in the 21st century, and many of us being white Christians, American Christians, what is our barometer for a healthy relationship with God or a healthy spirituality? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, we need to look very closely at what it is we're looking for politically, and what's the role, like, how can I say this? The question that Augustine asked, what's the role of a Christian king in a Christian empire? It's not a bad question, right? This is the first time they've been able to have a say in the leadership even of their nation. The premise, as I said earlier, was horrible. He accepted the fact that the nation was Christian, that there was such a thing as a Christian empire, which was completely contrary to what Jesus taught. See, the challenge with, and I could go on off on this question for hours. The challenge with this is it's a whole different paradigm that Christ is trying to get people to understand. The church, actually, I was going to read this later, but let me read this now in response. Well, let me say a few words. I'll read this at the very end. The thought I'll leave with you is something, a blog post I wrote about a year ago, 2 years ago. So let me phrase it this way. There was a very good article in the New York Times, probably 2 months ago, and it highlighted a speech that President Trump gave to white evangelicals at Dordt College in 2016. This is the speech where he said that he could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and not lose a single supporter. I remember that speech very clearly because I was actually on that same stage about 6 weeks earlier teaching about the doctrine of discovery. And the New York Times wrote an article about that a few months ago. And I was surprised they caught this, but they absolutely hit the nail on the head. They said that President Trump's interaction with white evangelicals is he's promising them power. This is what he's promising them. I will give you political power if you elect me. I preached a sermon probably in 2015, I think it was. It was called "You Don't Want to Live in a Christian Empire," right? Most Christians believe that their job is to make the nation Christian and to legislate their theologies. Now, they choose the theologies that they don't struggle with, or the sins that they don't struggle with, or that they like to point out in other people. They don't actually take the teachings of Jesus. Because if we're truly going to legislate the Christian theologies, right, we would have to start by legislating the Sermon on the Mount, right? I mean, if you're going to talk about essential teachings to the understanding of following being a Christian, you got to take the Sermon on the Mount. So if we're going to legislate that, right, now we're not just legislating murder. Now we're legislating anger. Right? Now we're not just legislating adultery or divorce. Now we're legislating lust. Right? Could you imagine living in a nation that legislated the Sermon on the Mount? That'd be a nightmare. Right? I don't want to live in that state. It'd be horrible. We have these things, right? Christians fighting for the right to pray, correct? In church, or not in church, in school. Remember that in 2016, there was this battle over this football coach who was fighting for his right to pray before the football game. Donald Trump actually took his side. And he said, you know, this guy, he's going into war, talking about the football team, and he's praying, and I think he's going to put them in prison, and he's going to go to jail. And I followed that story very closely. And it was kind of innocent. You know, this football coach would go to the center of the field after the game. He was at a public school, and he would start praying. And soon some of his players started joining him, and soon the opposing team started joining him. And this was a kind of a neat scene, right? All these people praying after the game. Well, the district stepped in and said, you're a coach in a public school, and this is not appropriate to do. There may be some of your students who join the prayer, not because they believe in the prayer, but because they don't want to be seen as outside of the team. You're compelling them, you're persuading them to do something. It's kind of coercive. And the coach made an interesting statement where he said, when he was being asked about it, he said, well, I'm a Christian who wears my faith on my sleeve. I'm not a Christian who's going to go off and just pray in the closet. Now, what's striking here is, what did Jesus say about when you're going to pray? Right? He said, if you're going to pray, don't pray piously in public where people can see you and you'll get your reward from them. So if you're going to pray, go into your closet, shut the door, don't let anyone see you. So Christians fighting for the right to pray piously in public, what we're fighting for is the right to pray in such a way that guarantees God's not going to hear our prayers. And this is somehow protecting religious freedom, right? We're not fighting for the rights of Muslims to pray. We're not fighting for the rights of Hindus to pray. We're fighting for the rights of Christians to pray. We don't mind if we compel people, if we coerce people, if we show them piously our faith, but we do not want to see any of that from other religions or faiths put onto our children. Right? So again, this is the problem, is we're not actually thinking through. This is where the question is, when we think about the question Augustine asked of what's the role of a Christian king in a Christian empire, it's a horrible question, because it implies our goal is to make the nation Christian. Now, had he asked what's the role of a Christian king in a secular empire, that's a much healthier question. Because our job is not actually to legislate our theologies. Our job, one of the things that makes a prophet so effective is they're not trying to, their focus is to speak the truth, not to compel people to behave a certain way. I mean, this is why the most effective prophets are the prophets who speak the truth, not prophets who are trying to make their message palatable so people will be more open to it. And so I think one of the things I point out is, because the church and its role, its prostitution out to empire, the church is no longer prophetic. The church is merely lobbying and protesting. That's all it is, right? I know, I live in Washington, D.C. I can tell who's in office without even knowing, because I look at who comes to town and for what reason, right? When I first moved here in 2015, it was all of my progressive left-leaning friends who were into town for meetings at the White House and for meetings with government agencies, and all my conservative friends were in town protesting and meeting with think tanks and everything else. During the Trump administration, it reversed. All my progressive friends were in town to protest, and all my conservative friends were in town to meet at the White House. And now that's going to switch again. The church isn't being prophetic. The church isn't speaking truth. The church is lobbying and protesting, which is not the role of the church. So I think, yeah, the barometer of the church is the church, the goal of the church. The call of Christ is to lose your life, right? It's to lose your life. It's to pick up your cross and to carry it to your own death. The goal of the church is to empty itself, to pour itself out. That's not the goal of the nation. The goal of the nation is to protect itself, right? Two contradictory goals. And so this is the challenge when the church becomes the empire. Now the church has to decide, is the church about losing its life or about saving its life? And because the empire is all about saving its own life, That's what the church identity becomes about. I have a great teaching I've given. It's on my website, wirelesshogan.com. Go under media to my video page, and there's a sermon I gave, or a teaching I gave at the Urban Youth Workers Conference. It's called The Biblical Dynamics of Power and Authority. And I look at the differences between worldly power and spiritual authority. And I look at how Jesus uses it, how Jesus uses authority, how the world uses power, and I create the contrast between the two. Power is the ability to act, authority is the right of jurisdiction, the permission to act. And I would say the church is called to exercise authority, not to demonstrate power. So I would encourage you, a longer answer to this question is to watch that sermon I preached on power and authority. And I can email it to you after the service, and you can share it with the link with your congregants there. But yeah, there's a whole lot to that question, but we have to completely change our barometer, which is right now, because of empire, the barometer is about saving life instead of losing it.
Thank you, Mark. That's so very helpful. We probably only have time for one more question. We wish we had a lot more time to spend with you. With so much more we could learn from you. But here's a question from Jen. Are there any other writers or teachers from the early centuries that would be helpful for us to learn from Augustine and Aquinas? Maybe if you could point us to some of those early writers.
So actually, the first part of Eusebius's book is pretty inspiring, right? The first 7 books of the volume, Ecclesiastical History, talks about the persecution of the church, and it holds up the martyrs. It doesn't begin to fall apart until Eusebius gets exposed to persecution himself and decides he's going to save his life instead of lose it. You know, so those are that. I mean, I was actually was very intrigued by what he was writing up until book 8, and then he seems to go off the rails a lot. And so yeah, I'm not, how would I say this? I don't spend all my time reading ancient writings. I think, you know, I looked at this book because I wanted to understand how this heresy was created. And so I did a lot of research into the writings of Eusebius. I did a lot of research into some of the stuff about Constantine. I looked at Augustine very closely. And the thing is, it's not that everything they teach is bad, right? When Peter, when he said to Jesus, "You don't have to die," yes, Jesus rebuked him and called him Satan, but he didn't reject him, right? And Peter went on to actually become one of the pillars, one of the cornerstones of the church, because he took that rebuke and grew from it and began to incorporate and teach correctly or properly after that. And so just because Augustine, like I call out Augustine, I say, yeah, here's where he goes off the rails. That doesn't mean I throw out everything Augustine ever wrote. It means I understand, okay, he's gone off the rails here. Once I know where he's kind of gone off, now I can filter the rest of his writings through that and glean from it what's still beneficial from there. So the trick is not to just make this completely binary, right? To just say, well, all of that's bad or all of that's good, but to say, okay, now that I know his bias, now that I know what he's, you know, where he ends up, I can now use that to filter the other stuff he's written, so I can still glean from it some things that are helpful.
When you talk about non-binary, I heard that throughout your talk, which I think is so helpful in trying to understand this. You're not canceling Augustine. You said Abraham Lincoln, one of our greatest presidents, and you may have been saying that with a little bit of a twinge there, or maybe even a little sarcastically, but there was some honesty there, but also you were able to say he's one of our greatest presidents, and also he was a white supremacist.
I need to correct that then. I don't hold Lincoln up at all.
Okay.
I do not. Yeah, I said one of our greatest presidents because that's what our nation believes.
Fair.
We have created Abraham Lincoln into a legacy, and most of what we know about him is not true.
Mm.
And I draw in my full lecture when I speak for several hours, I actually make the comparison. I draw the comparison, and it's very clear once you see it between him and Hitler. And so I'm saying we have to completely deconstruct this because we believe he's our greatest president, we actually don't see what he's done. And so, yeah, I would say what you're saying about Augustine, I would go there and say, yeah, that's true. I am working very hard to help people understand that because of how centered the white supremacy was in Abraham Lincoln's mind, and because of the way we've tainted him now for 150, 200 years, it's actually very, very damaging. And the fact that we don't know how to critique him means we merely perpetuate. Like it's striking, right, that this year, if you've listened to my political speeches, I call out how white supremacy is a bipartisan value, and it's on both sides. And they actually the two parties share the values for white supremacy, racism, and sexism more than confront them. And so it was interesting that the group that sought to unify the right under Joe Biden was called the Lincoln Project, right? Because very much Lincoln's writings make a whole lot more sense once you understand he was a blatant white supremacist and that he had no intention of including people of color in the dialogue or the narrative whatsoever. And so this is where I would say we have to be very careful about, because we put Lincoln in this place, and I would actually argue, had we been able to write more of the book, I would have argued that Christendom's Messiah figure was Constantine.
Yeah.
Western Christianity's Messiah figure is Abraham Lincoln.
Mm.
And we need to be look at that very carefully. So I'm sorry if I disrupted or interrupted you there, but I wanted to make sure I made that clear.
No, it's super helpful. I'm just trying to keep up. So I'm really grateful for that clarification. So I'm going to ask you one more question.
Yeah.
Then you said you had something you wanted to read us. And then I think hopefully this is conversation number one with you. We'd love to have you join us again in the future to go further with all of this stuff. So you talked about the church maintaining its prophetic voice and having lost its prophetic voice. The times I've heard you speak, and I think this morning is evidence of that, I would consider you a voice of conscience, a voice of truth telling to not only the church, but to the United States of America. And you ran for president in this last election, which some may say, like, how does that fit with that prophetic voice? So I would love to just hear you speak to that reality, recognizing like, Trump won because of evangelical support. He maintained a lot of white evangelical support. A lot of people of faith tried to justify why Biden was the most Christian or true Christian candidate. And that's all mixed up in it. And here you are as a prophetic voice to the church, to the United States, and you were running for office as well. Would you speak to how you made sense of that for yourself and sort of where we go from here?
Yeah. So one of the things, I said this throughout my campaign, is while I am a Christian, I was not the Christian candidate. And my goal was not to legislate my theologies or to evangelize my nation through my campaign or even through had I won through my time in office. I feel very strongly that, like I said about Augustine, had he asked the question, what does it mean to be a Christian leader in a secular empire? Right? If we're in a nation that gives us an opportunity to have a voice in in the direction of our nation and where it goes and what it does and how it lives that out, I think we need to step into that responsibly. Now, I would say what's not responsible is to Christianize your nation or to enforce your religion upon your nation, or to legislate your beliefs or your theologies. And so one of the things, because I saw that the foundations, our foundations of our nation were so deeply influenced by the doctrine of discovery, right? Our Declaration of Independence calls natives savages. Our Constitution excludes natives, Africans, and women. I gave a TEDx talk called "We the People: The Three Most Misunderstood Words in U.S. History" that goes into depth about 4 Supreme Court cases that establish and use the doctrine of discovery as the legal precedent for land titles. The first one in 1823, the last one, as I said, in 2005. And so one of my goals of my campaign was rooted in my faith, which is I wanted to acknowledge the humanity of everybody. I wasn't trying to save everybody. I wasn't trying to convert everybody. I wanted to live in a nation where the humanity of everybody was acknowledged. And part of the reason it's not, one of the main reasons it's not acknowledged is because of this heresy known as Christian empire. And so I felt like not only did our nation need to be presented another option, but it had to be done by someone who understood the history well enough that they wouldn't fall into the same trap. So for example, let me just give you an example. I pointed out, and you can see very easily how President Trump played to evangelicals to get their support. A few months ago, Joe Biden, talking about our nation's history, referred to slavery as our original sin. Now, this is problematic, right? Because there's a difference between something that's immoral or unjust and something that's sinful. And something immoral is something that's a commonly accepted term package of behaviors, and you're deviating from that. Or something that's unjust, there's an assumption of this is what's right, this is what's wrong, and you're doing something contrary to that. Sin is defined theologically. And sin is based on what may be a sin in one religious group or one form of beliefs may not be a sin in another. And so when Joe Biden referred to our original sin as a nation as slavery, what he's doing is he's casting this injustice in terms of a theological understanding based on the belief in a specific set of doctrines under a certain religious theme and even by a certain God. And so now he's going to right that wrong. Now you have to convince the entire nation that not only is this unjust, but it's a sin, which means you now have to theologically prove your own beliefs, and now you're legislating based on what is in your belief system. And so while I would say, would I define, could slavery be defined as a sin? Absolutely. Would I define it as a leader of a nation as this is our nation's sin? No, because I will acknowledge our nation is secular and pluralistic, and many of the people in our nation are not going to be convicted or convinced of something based on a theological understanding of a certain religious belief. And so again, this, like I said earlier, if you don't understand how deeply intertwined these things are, you're going to use this language and it's going to sound safe to you. Just like most Christians who fight for the right to prayer in school, right? They're thinking obviously about Christian prayer. I'm sure if their son or daughter came home and said, "Mom, Dad, guess what? We had a Muslim call to prayer today in school," right? They would not be happy. Most Christian parents, right? What are you doing? Because again, their worldview is so defined only by their own set of theological beliefs that they don't think about the fact that we live in a secular, pluralistic nation where we have to find a way to get along with everybody. And so this actually is a great segue into what I wanted to end with, which is to read this. I wrote this for, I do a lot of work with the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. And about 2 years ago, 2018, when we were in the height of the immigration crisis, kids being put in cages, families being separated at our borders. And I was asked by the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship to write out some of my prophetic message in the form of a proverb. And so I wrote this, and I'm going to read it to you now. This is also on my website at wirelesshogan.com. It's called From Prophecy to Proverb. Wise is the church that refuses to buy into the trappings of partisan politics. Remember, my brothers and sisters, Jesus did not come to create a Christian empire. He came to make disciples. He came to offer his body as a living sacrifice. He came to plant a church. When the church merely lobbies one political leader and protests the other, when for the sake of argument or political gain, the body of Christ turns a blind eye to one sin and magnifies another, we are not representing the headship of our body, who is Christ. As vile, repulsive, and urgent is the Trump administration's separation of families at our borders, it's not the first time. Indian removal, the slave trade, boarding schools, lynchings, Japanese internment camps, mass incarceration, even the deportation numbers of the Obama administration. The list of ways the US government has worked to destroy the family structure of people of color throughout our history is as long as it is depressing. So let's stop pretending that President Trump is a God-ordained savior or the ultimate demise of our union. The same with President Obama. What our nation needs is not for Democrats to be better Democrats, nor do we need Republicans to simply be better Republicans. We don't even need our nation to be more Christian. My brothers and sisters, the United States of America is not, never has been, nor will it ever be Christian. Jesus did not come to create a Christian empire. He came to make disciples. He came to offer his body as a living sacrifice. He came to plant a church. And wise is the church that refuses to buy into the trappings of partisan politics. I agree with Kenneth Kaunda, the former president of Zambia, who said, what a nation needs more than anything else is not a Christian ruler in the palace, but a Christian prophet within earshot.